We have some preliminaries, so let me go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series in St. John's College, Santa Fe, and I'm Walter Sterling, the Dean of the college. Glad to have you all joining us today for the lecture and then a question period that will be held in a Zoom meeting, and that link went out and can be found with this one. I'll also put it in the chat thread before the end of Dr. Thomas's talk. The talk will be about 30 minutes and then we will shift over. So just a bit after 5 o'clock, we'd expect to wrap up here. And as soon as we close out this webinar, we'll open the Zoom meeting for the question period. And we hope many of you will join us and we'll have lively conversation there. I want to mention that next week we have a lecture on black holes by a graduate of the college and physicist Daryl Haggard, and that will be our last lecture before our spring break, and that will be next Friday at this same time. So please join us for that. It is my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Charlie Thomas, who I've known for many years, but who I will begin by introducing in a more professional way as the Executive Director of the Association for Core Texts and Courses. And as those of you in our Santa Fe campus community saw this morning, that's an association that St. John's has long and deep ties with, and we're thrilled that Dr. Thomas is the executive director now, and we look forward to working with her in that capacity. And the annual conference of ACTC is coming up, and I'll remind again our faculty and our graduate students especially to take a close look at that if you haven't, and to consider joining many of us who will be attending that virtual conference around the second week of April. Professor Thomas is also professor of philosophy and director of the Great Books program at Mercer University. And most recently, I think in terms of publications, most recently author of the female drama, The Philosophical Feminine in the Soul of Plato's Republic. As I also said to our community this morning, Professor Thomas was going to be one of our plenary speakers in the conference that we were so excited to hold here last April on democracy, liberal education, and the common good. And some things happened in the world to postpone or defer the dream of that conference. We hope to have you back to our campus in the future for a full visit and a robust occasion. But in the meantime, we're very happy that you're willing to join us this way. And again, I will just say on a personal note that we have known each other for a long time, and I have learned a great deal from Professor Thomas as a fellow student, as a teacher, a reader of texts, and a leading voice in advocating for and defending just the kind of education that we care about at St. John's. So it's a real privilege to have you with us. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas to speak on Nicias's, or maybe Nicias's, virtue. Professor Thomas.
Thank you so much, Walter. It's wonderful to be here, and I appreciate the invitation so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I'm sorry I'm not there. I love the Santa Fe campus of St. John's. In fact, if you'll indulge me just very, very briefly, I looked at the participant list, and some of you I know very well, some of you not at all, and I'd like to tell you just a tiny bit about my little bit of autobiography, my connection to St. John's. I was an undergraduate student in the Great Books program at Mercer that I now direct. The Great Books program at Mercer is a 4-year program. Students don't just study great books as they do at St. John's, but they do have Great Books seminars, sort of crosses between what you guys do as seminars and tutorials. They have one of those every semester. And so the Great Books students at Mercer are a real cohort. They have a real identity on campus. I definitely identified myself as a Great Books student at Mercer. And in fact, I was only in the 3rd cohort of Great Books students at Mercer. It was a brand new program. And the people who helped us develop the curriculum, consultants for the program, were still coming around when I was a student, and they were from St. John's, and they were friends with my teachers. So I had, as an undergraduate, this sort of sense of St. John's being this place kind of in the clouds, maybe, where you got to do great books all the time and not just one course a semester. So I, as someone who loved what I was doing and loved the idea of doing it more, I wanted to know more. And so between my junior and senior year of undergraduate, I talked my way into the Graduate Institute at Santa Fe. I'm sure you guys run a much tighter ship than that now, but I'll always be grateful to whoever let me slip through the cracks and go to the Graduate Institute as an undergraduate. I do remember a phone call. I don't remember how I did it. Maybe it wasn't hard, maybe it was. I really don't remember, but I do remember a phone call where one of your admissions officers said, "You do know this is a graduate program, right? And you haven't graduated." And I remember saying something like, "Please," and that worked. And so I spent a summer on your campus in Santa Fe. Joan Silver taught my tutorial. Susu Knight was my preceptorial teacher. I did Kierkegaard with her. I hung out with public school teachers from Chicago. I scooped ice cream so I could go to the Chamber Music Festival for free. And I have a letter right here dated August of 1988 that says I'm welcome to come back. So who knows, maybe that'll still happen. But after my summer at St. John's, I finished college. I went to graduate school, and Mercer hired me back. So for the past more than 25 years, I have been happily laboring in the provinces of Great Books education. So I tell you that story about myself for 2 reasons. Oh, and I should add, it's important that I add, actually, that I have, as Dean Sterling said, I've very recently been appointed as the executive director of ACTC. And again, many of you know it, maybe some of you don't, but its explicit mission is to support undergraduate teachers who want students to pull up a comfortable chair to a spacious table in a well-lit room with an excellent book and see what happens. So I want you to know this little bit about me and my connection, so you know how sincere I am when I say that I'm very, very pleased to be here tonight. And also, in case those of you who are in the mothership, if you have messages for the provinces, for the hinterlands, I'll deliver them for you. So I'm the one, if that's what you need. Okay. This short paper I have today is on Thucydides, as Walter has already said and has been announced. And it's one of several little essays I've written in the last couple of years, as a part of a larger inquiry. I'm interested in the way that Thucydides' use of characters and speeches and even dialogue seem to presage Plato, and think about whether Thucydides' uses of characters and dialogue and speeches serve philosophy or approach philosophy in ways that have family resemblances to Plato's use of dialogue form and characters and speeches to pursue philosophy. So this is a small project. I don't mention Plato in here at all, but if you think you might see him in the wings, You do. He's definitely there. Okay, here we go. Thucydides famously insinuates himself into his history of the Peloponnesian War by writing fictional speeches for historical characters in real situations. And he is entirely upfront about it. Quote, "My habit has been to make the speakers say what was in my opinion demanded of them by the various occasions, of course, adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said," end quote. Thucydides writes speeches to anchor and animate his history, its characters, and the political and social dynamics they speak for. By loosening his commitment to the facts at hand, he attempts to convey the truth more clearly. But speeches are not Thucydides' only mode of inserting his beliefs and perhaps also his opinions into the history. Sometimes he editorializes. Thucydides simply breaks out of the narrative voice that dominates in the history, and he tells us some part of what he thinks about what's going on. This happens regularly enough that it is clearly a feature of Thucydides' approach and not an artifact of some lapse in the historian's focus. But these incidents are rare enough to be rhetorically powerful. They catch the reader by surprise and stand out as an effective way of underlining certain events and ideas that Thucydides seems to want to telegraph as important. Sometimes Thucydides offers these editorials to bring the significance of a particular event into focus relative to some more general context. In Book 7, for example, Thucydides writes that the Thracian attack of Macalisus was a disaster, quote, "unsurpassed in magnitude and unapproached by any in suddenness and horror," end quote. And famously, at the end of the same book, just after the annihilation of the Athenian forces in Sicily, he says that the victory of the Sicilians was the greatest Hellenic achievement in any war ever. Many of Thucydides' interventions take this form. This event was the most this or the greatest that. But on several occasions, at least two of which appear in Book 7, Thucydides breaks down the fourth wall to do something other than rank an event on a scale of historical importance. Here's 7.28, paragraph 3. But what most oppressed the Athenians was that they had two wars at once and had thus reached a pitch of frenzy which no one would have believed possible if he had heard of it before it had come to pass. For could anyone have imagined that even when besieged by the Peloponnesians entrenched in Attica, they would still, instead of withdrawing from Sicily, stay on there, besieging in like manner Syracuse, a city, taken as a city, in no way inferior to Athens, end quote. In some ways, these lines are like many others in the history, where Thucydides offers an account of the causes of the war or of various parts of it. What makes this passage stand out is his incredulity. He may prescinde from explicit commentary on the recklessness of the Sicilian campaign and restrict himself to subtler means of indirect critique most of the time. But here, he cannot contain his outrage at the Demos's decision not to recall the expeditionary force when the Spartan attacks from Decelea threw Athens into financial distress, and to add mortification, to insult, to injury, that particular campaign was masterminded by Alcibiades after his recent defection. Although Thucydides does not say it outright, it seems not just to be the foolhardiness of fighting two wars simultaneously that makes Athens' strategy incomprehensible to him. Also, Nicias' illness and his request to be relieved of his command, along with his losses on land and in the great harbor at Syracuse, all seem to point to the same obvious choice: withdraw from Sicily, cut Athens' losses, retreat. The second time Thucydides steps out in front of the narrative of Book 7 also concerns Nicias, but this time explicitly. After his account of Nicias's death, and just before he describes the horrific fate in the quarries of the Athenian soldiers who were taken prisoner in Sicily, Thucydides writes, quote, "This or the like was the cause of the death of a man who of all the Hellenes in my time least deserved such a fate, seeing that the whole course of his life had been regulated with strict attention to virtue." This is a fraught passage, and it has generated a great deal of commentary. It's one of those delicious questions about a carefully written, brilliantly conceived work that seems like it should be soluble once and for all, but that also seems to demand that the careful reader work it out for herself. It feels like the sort of mystery a great writer creates in order to teach his readers how he is to be read. Was Thucydides just expressing pity for Nicias here? Or was this a backhanded way to critique Nicias for an excessive commitment to self-preservation? Was Thucydides' Nicias virtuous indeed, but tragically living in a context where his virtue was not valued? Or does virtue, against our expectations, signal something problematic for human character, according to Thucydides, or perhaps something neutral and descriptive rather than something inherently commendable? Hobbes, in his translation, leaves out the last clause of Thucydides' formulation entirely, and thus omits the reference to Nicias's virtue. A provocative fact brought to my attention by my friend Norm Fisher, who wrote a very different essay on Nicias's virtue for a volume I edited for Mercer Press a few years ago. Here at 7.86, the historian inserts himself into the history, not to contextualize the relative significance of an event in relation to other events, but to contextualize Nicias's character in relation to the character of all other Hellenes that lived during Thucydides' time. Nicias regulated his life in strict accordance with virtue. His commitment to enacting virtue, to cultivating a character in harmony with his beliefs or understanding of what was possible and good for a human being, was more serious about living fully and well than any other Greek-speaking person of Thucydides' generation. It appears that in order to know what Thucydides means by this attribution of virtue to Nicias, we may need to understand more about what Thucydides thinks of the other Hellenes of his generation. That is, it seems that in order for us to understand Nicias's virtue and what it means to Thucydides, we also may need to understand Thucydides. Since Thucydides is a character in his own history, readers have an opportunity not just to see Thucydides at work as a historian, but also glimpse his approach to waging war. Of course, we only see General Thucydides through the lens historian Thucydides presents to us, but nonetheless, we have at least two aspects of Thucydides to consider when we work to understand him, which is one more than we usually have when it comes to working out authorial points of view. And while there are clear differences between them, on several occasions, Thucydides portrays himself, and this is both as a historian and as a general, Thucydides portrays himself and Nicias having similar opinions and responding in similar ways to similar situations. For example, in his first speech to the Athenian demos, Nicias objected to the Sicilian expedition for the same reasons that historian Thucydides said the expeditionary force should be recalled. Namely, the Athenians had been successful in the first war, but it had taken a toll, and the Athenians needed time to recover. While Athens was safe for the moment, it would not be in a good position to defend itself if the bulk of the military forces went abroad. Besides, according both to Thucydides and to Nicias, Athens had no legitimate business in Sicily. After the debates at Mytilene, and even more strikingly at Milos, the notion of legitimate business may not have had much meaning for the Athenians, but apparently it still did for Nicias and for Thucydides. And as if to underline the point, we are told at 7.18 that such matters of principle were important to the Spartans as well. Quote, "The Spartans derived most encouragement from the belief that Athens, with 2 wars on her hands, against themselves and against the Sicilians, would be more easy to subdue, and from the conviction that she had been the first to violate the truce. In the former war, they considered that the offense had been more on their own side, both on account of the attack of the Thebans on Plataea in time of peace, and also of their own refusal to listen to the Athenian offer of arbitration, in spite of the clause in the former treaty that where arbitration should be offered, there should be no appeal to arms." End quote. Thucydides tells us here that the Spartans felt they were on the moral high ground in this second war, while in the first war, they were inhibited by the fear that they might have been in the wrong. Athens' illegitimate aggression in Sicily had inspired them. In Book 4 of the history, Thucydides portrays his own loss at Amphipolis as having been caused by arriving too late to be effective, by no fault of his own. Brasidas' army already sat outside of the city, waiting for Peloponnesian allies within to take control, when Athenian allies sent for Thucydides to bring his army to defend the city. Thucydides was 8 days away, and he began the journey immediately. When Brasidas heard that Thucydides was on the way, he immediately moved on the city, knowing that Thucydides had strong contacts in Thrace and would probably wield significant diplomatic influence. Brasidas offered generous terms to the Athenians and Amphipolitans if they stayed, and he gave everyone 5 days to leave in safety if they chose to go. Because Brasidas appeared so reasonable, the inhabitants of the city were impressed by his virtue, and that's the word Thucydides uses there. They became sympathetic to him, and they surrendered. By the time Thucydides arrived at Amphipolis, Brasidas had created too secure a military and diplomatic position for Thucydides' army to challenge it. Thucydides hadn't tarried, but he was too late to join in the battle. He had no chance. He lost before he began. Apparently, the Athenian demos had a different view of the matter, though, or perhaps they didn't care about the circumstances of Thucydides' failure to defend Amphipolis. They exiled him as punishment. We, of course, are great benefactors of that miscarriage of justice, if that's what it was, since it was in exile in Thrace that Thucydides wrote his history. The parallels between Thucydides' disgrace and Nicias' destruction are striking. A defeat caused by a delay. Strong diplomatic connections nurtured over time that turned out not to be helpful at the decisive moment. Alienation from the demos. Almost every element of Thucydides' story of his own undoing is paralleled in the more tragic series of events that charts Nicias' downfall. Given the ways that he seems to liken Nicias' situation to his own, and given their shared criticisms of the Athenian demos, it is not surprising, perhaps, that Thucydides would be sympathetic to Nicias. They may be kindred spirits of sorts. But Thucydides does not praise Nicias for the things they appear to have in common, at least not explicitly. He does not say that Nicias did not deserve his horrible fate because he'd known all along that the Athenians should not have attacked Syracuse, although that seems to have been the case. Neither does Thucydides say that Nicias does not deserve his fate because his military failures were beyond his control, although that might also be true. Thucydides says that Nicias does not deserve his fate because the whole course of his life had been regulated with strict attention to virtue. We have a lot of text on Nicias. Book 7 of Thucydides' history is an almost entirely uninterrupted account of the Sicilian expedition, and Nicias' leadership is central to Thucydides' account. While he has a few important successes in Sicily, on almost every page of the text, Nicias seems to make strategic and tactical mistakes. Some of these may not be mistakes in principle, but in timing or in trusting certain sources of intelligence, but others appear simply to be wrong-headed. And on at least a few occasions, those mistakes seem to follow directly from something like Nicias' attempt to regulate his life with strict attention to virtue, depending, of course, on what we take Thucydides to mean by virtue. If we anachronistically analyze Nicias' actions in terms of the virtues that Aristotle would later systematize, Nicias does not really appear to be virtuous at all. If courage is having the right amount of fear of the right things at the right time for the right reasons, Nicias fails. What is the moral of the story of the eclipse other than Nicias having the wrong kind of fear of the wrong kind of things precisely at the worst possible time? If generosity is giving and taking the right amounts of the right things to and from the right people at the right time for the right reasons, Nicias likewise seems to fail. We're told that he had commerce of some sort with people in Sicily that he may have believed would ultimately contribute to his successes there, but they neither paid off militarily, nor did they protect him from execution after his army's defeat. And Thucydides explicitly says at that moment that, despite Nicias' friendships and diplomatic connections, they still put him to death. So Thucydides suggests that his relationships perhaps should have helped him in that context. One could perhaps stipulate that Nicias lacked external goods requisite for the development of virtue, but this would only make Nicias' failure to be virtuous lamentable. It would not alter the way the evidence seems to come together to suggest that Nicias was not, in fact, virtuous, despite perhaps how well disposed to virtue he may have been. If we avoid, and this is painting with a broad brush, we could look at other virtues and the case would be more complicated, of course. If we avoid Aristotelian anachronism and attempt to extrapolate a definition of virtue from Thucydides' account itself, we run into different problems. Nicias is portrayed as honest and loyal. He's pious and cautious. He sees the self-destructive trajectory of the Athenian demos and yet honors his commitments as a citizen and as a general. He is, by conventional contemporary standards, a good man. But when we look at Nicias' attempt to live virtuously in these terms, those same qualities appear to be at least partially responsible for his failures, at least partially responsible for his bad death. If he had not been so honest with his men about their odds, perhaps they would have been willing to make one last desperate attempt to board their ships, run the blockade, and escape the great harbor before the ships rotted. If he'd been less loyal to Athens, perhaps Nicias would have defected first to the home of one of his friends in Sicily, and then to somewhere safe and quiet to meet his death with more dignity and comfort. If he were not so pious, perhaps the eclipse would not have caused the delay of the Athenians' retreat until they were surrounded and cut off by the Sicilian and Peloponnesian forces, etc. If we understand virtue in these terms, it makes little sense to say that his attention to virtue made him undeserving of his fate. His virtue, in fact, sealed his fate in Sicily before his trireme even left Piraeus. So it seems that either Nicias is not virtuous or that his virtue led to his undoing. And in either case, Thucydides' comment seems problematic, unless Thucydides intends to imply something more subtle by presenting an apparent contradiction, perhaps a commentary on the tragedy of trying to live virtuously as a citizen of the Athenian demos in his own lifetime. Early in the history, Thucydides presents us with a speech by an unnamed Corinthian trying to convince Sparta to enter the war and protect its allies against Athenian aggression. The core of the Corinthians' rhetorical strategy is to describe Athenian character and Spartan character, and then show why Sparta must act against the inclinations of its national character in order to avoid destruction by the Athenians, whose national character suggests they will never self-regulate. The gist is that the Athenians will never stop themselves. They must be stopped, and they've become so big that only Sparta can stop them. The Corinthian speech serves another function in the history, though. As the Corinthians' assessment of Athenian and Spartan national character is affirmed in the action of the history, it also turns out that individuals who understand Athenian and Spartan national character are more effective in their dealings with Athens and Sparta. That is, those who know the character of the people with whom they're dealing are, unsurprisingly, more effective. This goes both for enemies who understand who they're up against, and for rhetoricians who can fit their arguments to their audiences. Understanding national character turns out to be key both for persuasion and force, patho and bia. While Spartan national character remains constant through the history, Athenian national character evolves, or perhaps it might be more accurate to say that it is the character of the Athenians to evolve. The Athenians build their empire and become, by their own admission, tyrants to those whom they conquer. This changes how they operate in the world, what strategies are most likely to defeat them, and what sort of speeches and speech makers are most likely to move them. Pericles was no angel, but he was no Cleon, and despite a few family resemblances, he was also no Alcibiades. The demos has changed as well, though. Cleon probably, maybe, I hope, could not have moved the demos when the Megarian revolt broke out in 447, but Pericles may not have been able to move them when they were debating the fate of the Mytileneans in 427, but Cleon could. And of course, he couldn't ultimately win that fight. There's Diodotus, but that's another big set of questions. By 416, when the Athenians debated whether or not to attack Sicily, Alcibiades was the man who could move the Athenians. He was the one who understood Athenian character, perhaps on instinct. Nicias either did not understand the character of the Athenians to whom he was speaking in the assembly, or he was unwilling to fit his speeches to them rhetorically. When Alcibiades told the demos that sending the bulk of the Athenian navy to Sicily was the right move, Nicias's attempt to reverse the vote was doomed from the beginning. Nicias's character and the character of the demos were not fitted to one another. And because Nicias seems only to act and speak in ways that are consonant with his character, his speeches were also not fitted to the demos. He could not persuade them. In fact, Nicias's two speeches are tours de force in how not to be persuasive. Everything he tried not only failed, it backfired. The most striking example is his attempt to dissuade the Athenians from supporting the expedition based on the argument that it would be too expensive. The Athenian reaction is immediate and unwavering. The more expensive, the better. The very thing Nicias presented to dissuade the demos from going to Sicily deepened their commitment to the expedition. In Herodotus's History of the Persian Wars, Themistocles is presented as the master of patho and bia, persuasion and force. Near the end of Herodotus's history, and after the victory at Salamis, Themistocles tells the Andrians that patho and bia are the two gods that traveled with him throughout his life. Thucydides' Nicias appears to be a sort of mirror image of Herodotus's Themistocles. where Themistocles manipulates religious sentiment to promote military ends by interpreting the wooden walls oracle to mean that the Athenians needed to evacuate the city. Nicias interrupts military action in deference to religious observance, delaying the Athenian retreat because of the eclipse. Where Themistocles and Alcibiades defect when it is clear that the Athenians have turned against him, Nicias stays loyal through sickness and death. Where Themistocles lies to promote Athenian interests at Artemisium and Salamis, Nicias tells the Athenians the truth of his situation, which he knows is probably a bad idea and which does no good at all. In fact, when he speaks the truth to his men, it seems that he renders them less willing to do some of the things that may have been sufficient to save them. Nicias does not seem capable of lying, and it completely undermines his capacity to be persuasive. Herodotus's Themistocles is an impious, treasonous liar who saves Athens from annihilation at least 3, and I think I would argue 4 times in Herodotus's account. Thucydides' Nicias is pious, loyal, and honest. And at least at the time of the Sicilian expedition, he is also hopelessly, fatally ineffective. When it comes to making sense of Thucydides' account of Nicias, and especially his claim that he deserved his fate least of any Hellene in the age because of his commitment to virtue, we must remind ourselves again that the author of the history was himself a military man, and that he was, by Athenian standards, a failure. Timing was his downfall, and Brasidas' brilliance. Brasidas is one of the most compelling and impressive characters in the history, maybe the most compelling and impressive, which one might argue is a bit convenient for Thucydides. Brasidas' success does not just put Thucydides' defeat and exile into context, but also Nicias's more catastrophic defeat and death. Thucydides does not just portray Brasidas as a great general, but also as a man of virtue. Leaning for a moment on Béton and Michael Palmer, it appears that Thucydides uses the word arete 43 times in the history. I did not do the count myself, I'm trusting them. 36 times in the speeches of his characters, and 7 in his own voice. In this list of Thucydides' 7 usages of the word arete, and what I have called his editorials, its attribution to Brasidas is 4th, a centrality that Palmer points out as pride of place. Brasidas is also shown to be a man whose virtue manifests in his military and political actions. The case of Brasidas suggests that acting virtuously and experiencing political and military success is possible for a Peloponnesian general, but perhaps not for an Athenian one in Thucydides' time. Or, to put the point in less speculative terms, Thucydides does not give us an example of an Athenian who takes a military command in the war and operates successfully from a position of virtue, or whose actions are described as virtuous. We see opportunist Athenian generals thrive and virtuous ones fail. A virtuous one fail. And yet, Brasidas was a Hellene in Thucydides' time, just as Nicias was. So unless we find some other way to qualify Thucydides' praise for Nicias, the implication seems to be that Nicias lived a more virtuous life than Brasidas did, even though his virtue was more effective. Perhaps this comes together to suggest that Nicias was a virtuous man who may have known how to be an excellent general of a certain sort, but that he was out of step with what Athens had become, apparently, as was Thucydides himself. But I think Thucydides pushes us toward an even darker conclusion. Nicias's virtue renders him entirely out of sync with Athens. That is, Nicias's virtue does not work in the Athens of Thucydides' time. It does not move the people by persuasion. It does not facilitate the best use of force. To be an effective Athenian politician in Thucydides' time, it appears, one cannot be religious, one cannot be honest, one cannot be loyal, at least all the time. This insight has relevance both for our attempts to understand Nicias and Thucydides himself, and the aims of his history. If this is what had become of Athens by 413, perhaps losing the war was not such a bad outcome for the Hellenic world. And perhaps exile in Thrace, with a pen, some papyrus, and a ready supply of ink, was a fine place for an Athenian general to end up.